Welcome to this meaning analysis. Today, we're embarking on a profound archaeological excavation of the mind.
Let's jump right in. Because, ancient wisdom reminds us, above every knower is a greater knower.
So, are you ready to push your limits and uncover some seriously hidden layers of truth? Expanding your mental capacity requires intense friction. It's exactly like hitting the gym to build physical muscle.
This shows us that without the actual struggle of mutation, there's absolutely no true intellectual evolution.
Layer 4. Moses and the Wise Servant. Here, we encounter a wildly profound and highly symbolic meeting. The servant commits 3 shocking paradoxes: damaging a ship, killing a child, and repairing walls for unwelcoming strangers.
Really ask yourself, could you ever justify killing an innocent child for crimes they haven't committed yet?
The whole trick is separating literal reality, just what things look like, from deep, symbolic truth. But what actually happens if ignorant people take these heavy, symbolic metaphors purely literally?
Exactly. It literally becomes murder. That's a tragic pattern we've seen on repeat throughout human history. This dangerously literal thinking justified massive historical atrocities, like the tragic Ottoman fratricide to protect their throne.
Moving to layer 5, the ethics of power, we have to examine what happens when knowledge meets absolute power. Just contrast the tyrannical, destructive conquests of Alexander the Great with the justice-driven leadership of Dhul-Qarnayn.
See, knowledge plus power without justice always creates tyranny. Justice is the only thing making power legitimate.
Watch how this builds. Caliph al-Ma'mun brilliantly used his supreme power to cultivate science instead of destruction. By trading conquered castles for Greek philosophy books, he empowered absolute geniuses like Al-Khwarizmi and Jabir.
So, are you Dhul-Qarnayn? How does all this intense history apply to your everyday actions right now?
Enter the butterfly effect. It's the reality that every tiny choice you make triggers massive, universal change.
You possess free will, right? That's fundamentally your superpower, to just hit the brakes on negative actions. The ultimate core rule of both modern law and ancient wisdom is super simple. First, do no harm.
So I'll leave you with this. What kind of butterfly effect are you going to create today?
All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're unpacking a seriously fascinating analysis of an ancient text known as Surah Al-Kahf. But listen, we aren't approaching this as some dry standard history lesson, not at all. Instead, we're looking at this source material as an actual excavation of human consciousness. As you'll see, we're going to explore how these ancient, highly symbolic texts were literally designed to push the absolute limits of human intellect. To navigate all this dense material, we're using 5 layers of truth as our map for this explainer. We've got the meaning dig, allegory and truth, knowledge versus wisdom, power and justice, and finally, free will and the butterfly effect. Let's jump in. So, layer 1, the meaning dig, unearthing concepts. The speaker in our source material introduces this really powerful central metaphor right from the get-go. They argue that reading a text like this, it requires serious, hard mental labor. It's an archaeological dig, an excavation of concepts. It's highly symbolic stuff. It is absolutely not something you can just casually skim over while drinking your morning coffee. No, it's meant to be aggressively dug into. You're supposed to break a mental sweat to find the treasures buried beneath the surface. So the crucial takeaway here is that this ancient text intentionally uses what's called a symbolic method. By using elliptic storytelling and deep metaphor, it forces your brain to work so much harder. Think of it exactly like physical exercise. Just as a muscle only really grows when it's pushed to its absolute limits and forced to adapt, human consciousness expands when it grapples with these complex symbolic puzzles. It's a workout for your mind. Moving right along to layer 2, allegory and truth, the danger of literalism. Now, this brings us to a very concrete example from the text where we encounter the deeply paradoxical parables of Moses and the wise servant. The source highlights a story where a wise servant commits 3 completely jarring acts. They're wild. He damages the ship of poor workers who offered them a ride. He actually takes a young boy's life. And then he freely repairs a wall for a deeply hostile town. The speaker explains that these completely paradoxical acts are profound mysteries. They are deliberately placed there to genuinely shock the reader's moral compass. So how in the world do we resolve this paradox? Well, the speaker does this by drawing a very strict distinction between literal reality and symbolic truth. Outwardly, the literal reality of these actions is brutal, right? It seems totally unjust. But the hidden truth represents a divine justice operating on a level that humans simply cannot see. And this is exactly why this matters. The absolute essential takeaway here is that these literal actions cannot and absolutely must not be replicated as human law. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the speaker's stark warning. Taking deeply symbolic, allegorical text literally leads to horrific real-world consequences. As the quote goes, when allegory becomes literal in the hands of the ignorant, it becomes murder. When human beings try to act like the divine force in the story, completely bypassing human law and justice, it literally becomes murder. The explainer impartially points to historical examples to really hammer this point home. The speaker notes how power has frequently weaponized literalism throughout history, whether it was extremist cults like the Archetypes attacking their neighbors, or the Ottoman Empire's actual law of fratricide where rulers eliminated their own brothers. In both of these cases, a twisted, literal interpretation of religious concepts was used to justify brutal political crimes. So, you see, this isn't just ancient history, it's a timeless warning about how power weaponizes texts. All right, that brings us to layer 3, knowledge or wisdom, the dual nature of intellect. You know, knowing facts is very, very different from understanding how to actually use them. The speaker argues here that knowledge without a moral compass is fundamentally catastrophic. It leads straight to arrogance and destruction, much like the creation of the atom bomb. On the flip side, though, knowledge paired with wisdom builds human dignity, consciousness, and humility. That is the kind of intellect that drives true scientific discovery and enlightenment. To show us what a society that prioritizes that kind of wisdom actually looks like, the source shares this awe-inspiring look at the Abbasid House of Wisdom. Past leaders prized knowledge so highly that scholars literally mapped the Earth's coordinates by hand in 820 CE. And incredibly, just 10 years later, Caliph al-Ma'mun traded actual physical gold to buy ancient Greek philosophy texts from his military enemies in Byzantium, just to preserve human wisdom. I mean, it is absolutely amazing to think they prize learning so much they'd fund their own enemies just to secure it. Moving into layer 4 now. Power and justice. The tale of the two-horned ruler. This brings us to the fascinating philosophical relationship between power and justice, which the source analyzes through the story of Dhu al-Qarnayn, or the two-horned ruler. It poses a really timeless rhetorical question for us. Does every ruler who gains immense power inevitably become a tyrant? Think about human history for a second. It's a completely valid concern, and it perfectly sets up the speaker's analysis of what a genuinely righteous ruler actually looks like in this ancient text. The speaker argues that Dhu al-Qarnayn was the exact opposite of a tyrant. Unlike conquerors such as Alexander the Great, who literally demanded to be worshipped as a god, this ruler respected the cultural differences of the vulnerable tribes he encountered. And here is why this matters. He used his intellect and hard resources, like iron and copper, not to conquer or destroy, but to build protective barriers. He used his power strictly to stop tyranny and shield the oppressed. This really brings us to the core political philosophy of the explainer, which is incredibly striking. The speaker firmly asserts that power without justice is entirely illegitimate. Period. If a state's power does not actively convert into justice for its people, well, the speaker argues that state devolves into nothing more than organized banditry. Just organized banditry. It's a powerful concept. And that brings us to our fifth and final layer, free will and the butterfly effect, leaving your mark. Ultimately, all of this excavated wisdom culminates in how we actually exercise human free will. The speaker introduces the concept of the butterfly effect here. You know, just as a meteorologist once theorized that the tiny flap of a butterfly's wings in Africa could eventually cause a massive hurricane across the globe, our human free will operates in the exact same way. The tiny, everyday, individual moral choices we make, when they're truly rooted in wisdom, can ripple outward to completely change the reality of the world around us. And this leaves us with a really provocative final thought from the source. Can you leave a butterfly effect in your own sphere of influence? It challenges us to reflect not just on what we've learned today, but on how we are actually going to apply this excavated wisdom to our own daily choices. The dig doesn't end here, folks. It starts right now with your very next choice.
You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of clinical precision.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Total certainty.
Yeah, exactly. You break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line in the humerus, and the doctor just points to the screen and says, well, there it is. There's the problem.
Right. It's binary.
Exactly. It's binary. It's broken or it's not broken. And I think we find a lot of comfort in that. We love things to be visible, categorized, and, easily fixable.
We crave that diagnostic certainty in almost every aspect of life.
Yeah.
I mean, we really want a clear map with an X marking the spot.
But then you step into the world of ancient philosophical texts and human morality, and suddenly that X-ray machine is completely useless.
Totally obsolete.
Right. You're looking at a landscape of human consciousness that is incredibly murky. And that is the absolute definition of where we are heading today with you, the learner. We are going on an archaeological dig of meaning today.
And it is a deep one. It really is. We are centering our deep dive on a profoundly complex lecture by the thinker Mustafa İslamoğlu. Specifically, we're unpacking his 98th lesson on a really dense ancient text from the Quran known as Surah Al-Kahf.
And what makes this particular lecture so captivating is that he refuses to treat the text as a literal chronological history book.
Thank goodness, because that's always how it's presented.
Yeah. Instead, he treats it as a multi-layered philosophical puzzle. It tackles, knowledge, morality, free will, and the ethics of power.
So to give the learner a sense of the terrain we're covering, we're focusing on what the lecture identifies as the final two layers of truth in this text.
Right, and getting to the bottom of those layers requires traveling far beyond just like ancient mythology.
Oh, way beyond.
We are going to examine the mechanics of modern genetics, the underlying physics of thermodynamics, and the cascading ethics of the butterfly effect.
It's like this wild synthesis of archaic symbolism and cutting-edge science. So, okay, let's unpack this. I want to start with the very nature of how we learn.
That's the best place to begin. Because, why are texts like this written in such a frustratingly opaque way? The lecture makes this really compelling argument about the intentional use of symbolic metaphorical language.
Yeah, the claim is that ancient texts use metaphor not to obscure the truth, but to literally increase human cognitive capacity.
And the analogy that really struck me in the source was about computers, which is wild for an ancient text.
It's a great modern framing, though.
It is. The argument is that wrestling with complex metaphorical language is the mental equivalent of adding RAM to an old computer. Like it expands the mind's nearly infinite capacity to process reality.
It's a highly functional analogy.
Yeah.
I mean, random access memory, RAM, is your computer's short-term workspace.
Right.
So if you have a massive software program, a computer with low RAM will just freeze. It can't hold all the necessary simultaneous data points in its active
So
memory.
it just crashes.
Exactly. The human mind possesses a staggering, almost limitless theoretical capacity. But that capacity sits entirely dormant unless it is actively strained.
Strained. I love that word choice in the text.
Yeah, the lecture draws these brilliant biological parallels to illustrate it. Think about human physiology. If you want to increase muscle mass, hypertrophy requires physical strain.
You literally have to damage the muscle slightly to force it to adapt.
Yes. You have to lift a weight heavy enough to create microscopic tears in the muscle fibers. And then the body overcompensates during the repair process, right? It builds the muscle back denser and stronger.
The same principle applies to lung capacity, doesn't it?
Completely. You cannot increase the elasticity of your alveoli by just sitting on a couch, breathing at a resting rate. You must force respiration.
You have to push the lungs into a state of acute physical stress.
Right. Taking it a step further, the underlying mechanism of all evolution, biological mutation, is born from environmental strain.
Wow.
A species develops a new trait because the environment exerted a pressure that forced a biological adaptation. Biologically speaking, humanity is the end product of millions of years of resistance.
So the strain of deciphering heavily metaphorical language isn't a bug in the text.
No, it is the fundamental feature.
That intellectual friction, like the headache you get trying to understand a paradox, that is the exact mechanism that gives birth to wisdom.
And the imagery used to describe how that wisdom is stored is incredibly vivid in this lecture.
Oh, the pen versus chisel thing?
Yes. The argument categorizes human knowledge by how easily it fades. So some casual knowledge is written in pencil. You read a trivia fact, you forget it a day later.
Right, like what I had for breakfast.
Exactly. Academic knowledge might be written in pen. But true wisdom, the kind gained through the intense strain of lived experience, is carved into stone with a chisel.
And the comparison the speaker makes is to a mother going through the immense visceral difficulty of childbirth.
It's a powerful image.
It really is. That profound physical and emotional strain creates a psychological anchor. It's a wisdom that you can't just, buy at a bookstore or skim in a pamphlet. It is chiseled into the architecture of human memory.
That lived experience is the chisel. You cannot inherit deep understanding passively. You have to endure the cognitive load.
I want to play devil's advocate here, though.
Go for it.
I understand the gym analogy, like, you have to lift the heavy weights. But if the ultimate goal of a manual or a text is just to make the reader understand a concept, why make the reader sweat at all?
The efficiency argument.
Right. Why not just write the manual plainly? If I buy a complicated piece of IKEA furniture, I don't want a 12-page poem about the spiritual nature of Swedish pine.
You just want the table built.
Exactly. I want clear, sequential, step-by-step instructions. Give me the hex key and tell me where the screws go.
And that is the exact frustration most people hit when confronting dense philosophical or theological texts. They want the hex key.
Yeah, it's exhausting otherwise.
But the lecture provides a fascinating counter-premise that completely reorients the purpose of reading. The goal of this specific kind of text is not to transmit information.
Wait, then what is it?
The goal is to generate consciousness. In the original Turkish, the thinker makes a really sharp linguistic distinction between the word bilgi, which means raw information.
Okay, bilgi is information.
Right, and balins, which translates to consciousness, or like deep moral awareness.
So an IKEA manual gives you bilgi, but it doesn't give you balance.
Let's follow that logic. Information cures ignorance. If you don't know how to build the table, the manual cures that specific lack of data.
Right.
But wisdom or consciousness cures arrogance. An instruction manual doesn't change your moral character. It doesn't force you to evaluate your place in the universe.
Oh, wow.
Straining against a text, confronting brutal paradoxes, and wrestling with metaphors that defy easy categorization, that process humbles the reader.
It yanks you out of your intellectual complacency.
Exactly. It forces you to admit that you don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
And that is the prerequisite for actual consciousness.
Information cures ignorance, but wisdom cures arrogance. That completely shifts the metric of what makes a text valuable.
It's not about how many facts you can memorize.
No, it's about the psychological transformation of the reader. But if knowledge and information alone aren't the ultimate goals, we arrive at a much darker implication here.
We do.
It suggests that raw information, divorced from consciousness, can actually be catastrophic.
This completely shatters the deeply ingrained cultural assumption that being highly educated or knowledgeable automatically makes someone a good person.
And the lecture highlights this with a really shocking assertion. The source bluntly states, Satan was not a scholar.
It's such a striking way to phrase it.
It is. There is this powerful pushback against the tendency to equate mere data accumulation with virtue. We just assume that someone who knows a lot of facts or holds a lot of degrees is inherently trustworthy or morally sound.
What's fascinating here is how the mechanics of knowledge are conceptualized by the speaker. Knowledge is framed purely as energy.
Energy, like physics energy.
Yeah, and like any form of energy in physics, it possesses a duality based on how it is directed. In the Arabic terminology used in the lecture, knowledge can manifest as nar, meaning fire.
Nar is fire.
Right. Or nur, meaning light.
I want to dig into how that actually works in practice. How does the exact same knowledge become fire or light?
Well, let's look at the mechanics of nuclear physics, the underlying mathematical reality of atomic structure, and understanding how to split a uranium atom and release the binding energy of the nucleus.
Right, that's just science.
Exactly. It's morally neutral data. It's just a fact of the universe. If you apply that exact same scientific knowledge, that bilgi, to build a controlled fission reactor, you generate electricity.
To light up an entire city, powering hospitals and homes.
Yes. That manifestation is nerve, light. However, if you take that identical understanding of critical mass and chain reactions, and you engineer an atomic bomb to instantly vaporize hundreds of thousands of human beings,
then that manifestation is nor fire.
The data didn't change at all. The atomic physics didn't change.
It's the consciousness, the balance behind the application that determines whether the knowledge illuminates civilization or incinerates it.
Precisely. And to prevent the misuse of that kind of power, the lecture makes an incredibly bold, almost iconoclastic argument.
This part blew my mind.
It argues for the complete stripping of holiness away from all physical things.
Yeah, the text asserts that absolutely nothing physical on earth is inherently holy. Not a single location. Not Mecca, not Jerusalem, not the Kaaba, not a historical prophet's hair, not a sacred cloak. Nothing.
The theological stance presented is that only the Creator, Al-Quaidas, possesses inherent holiness. Everything else is just matter.
It is a radical epistemological shift.
Yeah,
and the source argues it's driven by a very specific protective mechanism, right?
It is. Because the danger of assigning inherent holiness to physical objects or locations or even social statuses is that you inadvertently create a mechanism for tyranny.
Because you hand a blank check of authority to whoever manages those things?
Exactly. Let's examine how that mechanism works socially. If you convince a population that a specific piece of geography or a specific artifact is the literal manifestation of the divine on Earth,
then anyone who questions the caretakers of that artifact is suddenly framed as questioning God.
Right, you can't question the clergy who hold the keys. The lecture even extends this critique to human statuses, specifically targeting the concept of motherhood.
Which is nearly universally viewed as the ultimate sacred, unquestionable status across all cultures.
Yeah, but the argument notes that motherhood, as an abstract category, isn't inherently holy.
Because there are abusive parents.
There are parents who act as emotional and physical vampires, draining the life from their children. When a society sanctifies the status itself, saying all mothers are holy, you end up structurally protecting the abuser.
You demand that the victim submit to the abuse, all in the name of preserving this supposedly holy concept.
It's incredibly damaging.
But if you're listening to this and thinking, well, if absolutely nothing physical or human is inherently holy, what anchors people's reverence?
Right. It can feel very cynical at first glance.
Doesn't that strip the magic out of the world and leave us with a cold transactional reality? I mean, that was my immediate reaction. If there are no sacred places, what are we even doing?
And the lecture anticipates that exact existential dread. It doesn't argue that places cannot be sacred. It argues about how they achieve that state.
Okay, so how do they...
The mechanism of sanctity is action. It is the human actions performed in a specific location that draw down the blessing.
So a place isn't holy because of its GPS coordinates or its ancient architecture?
No, it becomes a blessed environment because human beings consistently perform good deeds there. They show mercy, they feed the hungry, they enact justice.
The good deeds essentially charge the location with a spiritual resonance?
Exactly. The reverence is anchored entirely in moral action, not physical geography.
So you have to constantly earn the blessing through your behavior. You can't just coast on the fact that you're standing in a famous building or holding a prestigious societal title.
You're never off the hook.
That rigid distinction between divine truth and human action sets us up perfectly for one of the most controversial, mind-bending narratives in the source material.
The fourth layer.
Right. We're moving into the fourth layer of truth in the text. The intense paradox of Moses and the wise servant.
This narrative is specifically designed to short-circuit the brain of a literalist.
Oh, it completely short-circuited mine.
It forces the reader into a state of extreme cognitive dissonance.
The setup is this, just to summarize for the listener. Moses, the prophet Musa, is operating under the belief that he is the wisest man alive. So, to shatter this arrogance, he is instructed to travel and find a specific wise servant.
Now, in broader historical mythology, this figure is often identified as Khidr.
Though the lecture makes a deliberate point to clarify that the Quran itself never uses that name. Right.
Right, it just describes a servant granted a special, incomprehensible knowledge from the divine.
The entire point of the journey is to teach Moses a humbling principle. Above every knower is a greater knower.
And this is where the text demands the maximum use of that metaphorical ram we discussed earlier.
Yeah, boot up the ram.
Because Moses and the wise servant agree to travel together, but the servant lays down a strict condition. Moses must not question any of his actions, no matter what happens, until the servant chooses to explain them.
Which sounds easy until you hear what the servant actually does. What follows are three profoundly paradoxical, seemingly wicked events.
Let's walk through them.
First, they are taken in and hosted by some poor fishermen on a ship. And the wise servant intentionally damages their boat, putting their entire livelihood at risk.
That's the first test.
Second, and by far the most shocking, the servant kills a young boy.
Just straight up murder.
Yeah. And third, they arrive at a town that flat out refuses them any hospitality, leaving them hungry and vulnerable. But instead of leaving or retaliating, the servant goes out of his way to freely labor and rebuild a crumbling wall in that very town.
And after every single event, Moses completely loses his patience, breaks his promise, and vehemently objects to the injustice of the actions.
Which, I mean, is completely understandable.
To truly feel the weight of these paradoxes, though, we have to reconstruct the cultural and historical mechanics of the ancient world, particularly regarding that third event with the wall.
Let's do that. The lecture zeroes in on the ancient law of the guest, right?
Yes. Known in Turkish culture as Tanrı Misafiri, or God's guest. Let's dive into the mechanics of ancient travel. Why was hospitality considered a life-or-death moral absolute?
Imagine the physical reality of the ancient world. A human traveling on foot or with a simple pack animal could cover a maximum of maybe 30 to 40 kilometers a day.
There are no cell phones, no emergency services, no lighted highways.
No centralized police force. When you are out on the road, you are entirely at the mercy of the elements and the people you encounter.
A stranger appearing at your door at dusk was a complete black box. You had zero data on them.
They could be a saint, or they could be a scout for a band of marauders looking to slit your throat and steal your livestock.
Taking a stranger into your home was an enormous, terrifying risk. Yet, despite that risk, it was universally considered the ultimate sacred duty.
It was the only way human beings could survive long-term travel. By refusing them, the town isn't just being rude, are they?
No, they are violating a profound social contract that keeps civilization from collapsing into barbarism.
Right. Yet the wise servant completely subverts human justice. He rewards this dangerous antisocial behavior by fixing their wall for free. It defies all human logic.
It does.
But here's where it gets really interesting. As a modern listener processing this story, I am 100% with Moses.
You're supposed to be.
Damaging a poor person's boat. I can maybe accept there's a trick to it, like making it look unappealing so a tyrant won't confiscate it, rebuilding a wall for hostile townsfolk. Annoying, but whatever. Maybe it's a lesson in radical forgiveness. But killing a child,
That's a sticking point.
because they, as the story supposedly justifies later, might grow up to be bad, that is premeditated murder. How is any reader supposed to metabolize this? It feels like a terrifying theological justification for atrocities.
The visceral horror as rejection you're feeling right now is the intended psychological response. The lecture's crucial stabilizing thesis here is this. As human beings operating in the physical world, we are bound by Moses' reactions, not the servant's actions.
That feels so counterintuitive, though. Usually in these ancient texts, the mysterious wise figure is the one we are supposed to emulate. Are you saying we aren't supposed to act like the wise servant?
Under no circumstances are humans to emulate the servant.
Okay, thank God.
The lecture argues that the servant represents the incomprehensible mechanics of divine paradox, the ultimate underlying truth, or hakikat.
Hakikat.
Yes. Moses, on the other hand, represents human law, human morality, and physical reality. Kirseklik. So Moses was right.
Moses was absolutely correct to object. In the framework of human reality, you cannot preemptively punish an individual for a crime they have not yet committed. Human justice requires an action to judge.
That makes so much more sense.
And the lecture issues a severe, historically grounded warning here. When ignorant or power-hungry people take these deeply symbolic metaphors literally, the direct result is tyranny and mass murder.
And the lecture points to a very specific historical manifestation of this danger.
It highlights an extremist puritanical sect in early Islamic history known as the Khawarij. The Khawarij, what did they do?
Certain factions within this movement utilized a literal interpretation of this exact narrative to justify slaughtering the families and children of their political rivals.
Oh my God.
Their twisted logic was, well, the wise servant killed the child because the child possessed the potential for future evil. Therefore, we are justified in preemptively eliminating the offspring of our enemies.
That is horrifying.
The lecture aggressively dismantles this. Literalizing a metaphor designed to explore the outer boundaries of human comprehension is a crime against the text itself.
When you drag the purely symbolic into the realm of human governance, it instantly becomes a weapon of terror.
Absolutely. The story functions as an extreme thought experiment about the limits of our perspective. It's a reminder that we don't have access to the grand algorithm of the universe.
So we must adhere to strict, observable human justice. But, the internal logic given within the story itself, the excuse that a child would grow up to be a force of destruction, it forces us to open a massive, highly uncomfortable door into modern philosophy and science.
It really does.
It demands we ask, can someone literally be born bad?
This creates a fascinating pivot in the material. It leaps from the ancient sands straight into the laboratories of modern genetics. The core question becomes, are humans biologically predisposed to criminality?
And the lecture acknowledges that undeniable genetic predispositions exist.
It brings up the widely studied sports gene, right?
Yeah, the genetic variations that contribute to the fast-twitch muscle fibers and oxygen processing seen in elite world-class athletes like Usain Bolt.
It also references the FOXP2 gene, the so-called speech gene.
Right. The lecture notes that a crucial mutation in this specific genetic sequence, roughly 200,000 years ago, rewired the neural circuitry of the human brain and the motor control of the larynx, allowing our species to develop complex articulate language.
Which is mind-blowing on its own. But if we readily accept that microscopic strands of DNA dictate our ability to run at record speeds or form complex sentences,
we have to confront the terrifying corollary. What about a murder gene? What about a stealing gene?
we are stepping into the ultimate battleground of determinism versus free will, viewed through the lens of modern neurocriminology.
If the architecture of our brain and the cocktail of our neurochemistry dictate our impulses, how culpable is the conscious mind?
The thinker shares a highly memorable, almost tragicomic anecdote from his own life to illustrate this biological determinism.
The Gulkuk prison story.
Yes. He recounts a period he spent in Gulkuk prison in Turkey. While there, he interacted with a Roman inmate who suffered from profound, undeniable kleptomania.
And the story goes, one afternoon, this inmate's favorite sports team won a major match. So in a burst of celebration, he bought sodas for the entire cell block.
And the thinker pulled him aside and asked, point blank, if the money used to buy those sodas was earned honestly.
And the inmate just laughed at the absurdity of the question and replied, I stole a midwife's face when I was born.
He was acknowledging that theft was his baseline state of existence from his very first breath.
The man was physically incapable of suppressing the urge to steal. The thinker notes that this inmate had a history of stealing cars, driving them to a secluded spot, and just leaving them sitting on blocks.
He didn't even want the cars.
No. He just couldn't resist the urge to steal the wheels. He was a prisoner of his own neurochemistry long before he was ever locked in a cell.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? If someone is born with an overpowering, genetically hardwired urge to take what isn't theirs, or worse, to commit violence, where does the concept of free will actually live?
It's the ultimate ethical dilemma. How can a justice system claim to be fair if it's punishing people who are essentially fighting a losing battle against their own biology?
And the lecture offers a very specific mechanical definition of free will to resolve this tension, doesn't it?
It does. It suggests that free will is not the accelerator of human action. It is the brake pedal.
The brake pedal. Okay, walk me through the mechanics of that.
Consider the neuroscience of how an impulse is generated. Deep within the older structures of the brain, like the amygdala, urges, desires, and emotional responses are generated instantaneously and unconsciously.
You don't choose them.
Right. The lecture links this to the concept of the butterfly effect occurring within our own neural pathways. You do not consciously choose to feel a sudden spike of road rage.
Or a pang of jealousy.
Or a sudden, irrational urge to take something from a store shelf. The impulse simply arrives. It rises up unbidden from your deep biology.
But the human prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, has the power to veto that impulse.
According to this framework, human free will is almost entirely located in our capacity to stop the action. Free will is the agonizing split-second decision to apply the brakes and not act on the biological urge.
The underlying impulse is the deterministic biology, but the ultimate veto power is the free will.
Yeah.
But what happens when the brakes completely fail?
That is the crisis of the incurable recidivist. For individuals whose urges are so neurologically overwhelming that their executive function cannot apply the brakes, society has historically responded with brutal finality.
Yeah, ancient legal codes utilized irreversible methods like the death penalty or the amputation of hands to physically, permanently disable the individual's ability to act on the urge.
But the lecture speculates on a radically different future. It introduces the possibility of utilizing technologies like CRISPR gene editing.
Okay, let's explain how that would actually work for the learner. CRISPR utilizes a specialized enzyme like Cas9, guided by a piece of RNA, to act as molecular scissors.
It literally acts as a pair of molecular scissors.
Oh, wow. It can locate a very specific sequence of DNA inside a living cell, cut it, and either disable a gene or allow scientists to insert a new sequence.
Exactly. The lecture posits a theoretical future where, instead of locking a kleptomaniac in a concrete box or cutting off their hand, medical science identifies the exact genetic sequence causing the uncontrollable impulse.
They send in the Cas9 enzyme, snip out the problematic sequence, and cure the urge at the molecular level.
It's a staggering thought experiment.
Yeah.
Editing the biological code to solve a moral failure.
It's science fiction that is rapidly becoming science fact. But while that might solve individual criminality, it aggressively scales up the philosophical problem.
How so?
Because if human beings are forced to navigate these deeply flawed biological urges, if the genetic code itself is prone to disastrous mutations, what about the macro level of suffering?
Ah, yes.
The text zooms out to address the biggest listener question of all, the one that keeps theologians awake at night. If biology and genetics cause immense suffering, if the system is designed with flaws, why did the creator design a universe that includes death, pain, and profound disability in the first place?
This is the classic problem of evil, the theodicy debate. If a creator is both all-powerful and entirely good, why does terrible suffering exist?
And the lecture tackles this head-on by separating natural suffering from human-caused evil.
It starts with the mechanics of the natural world, using the brutal reality of a lion hunting and killing a gazelle.
If you are the gazelle or you're watching a nature documentary emphasizing with the gazelle, that event is an absolute horror. It looks like sheer cruelty.
But the lecture unpacks the underlying physics to reframe this. A lion killing a gazelle is not an act of malice.
The lion isn't angry at the gazelle.
Exactly. The lion does not hate the gazelle. What you are witnessing is a macro manifestation of the second law of thermodynamics, entropy.
It is the inescapable cycle of energy transfer. The universe is constructed on a fundamental principle that highly ordered states must break down to provide the raw energy for new ordered states to form.
The gazelle consumes the ordered energy of the grass. The lion consumes the ordered energy of the gazelle. It is a closed loop of creation and destruction.
And the lecture makes a remarkably sharp point regarding the necessity of death specifically. It argues that if humans were suddenly granted biological immortality, it would be a disaster.
Complete disaster. Every ounce of human wealth, every resource, every drop of energy would be hoarded and spent trying to maintain that immortality.
Society would stagnate entirely. The cycle has to continue. And there's a brilliant medical analogy used here. If the old, damaged cells in a human body suddenly decide they are going to refuse to die to make way for new, healthy cells.
We have a clinical term for that state: cancer.
It is a profound analogy. Cellular death, apoptosis, is an absolute requirement for the overall health and continuation of the organism.
Death in the natural world operates as a mechanism of balance, not a design punishment. But where the lecture draws a very hard, uncompromising line is in differentiating between this natural entropic cycle and human-caused tragedy.
It issues a scorching rebuke to anyone who attempts to blame God for the evil that humans consciously choose to inflict upon each other.
This segment really stood out.
It really did. And just to be clear, we are reporting the source's arguments impartially here, but the emotion in the text is intense. The thinker mentions a horrific school shooting where innocent children were massacred.
He expresses an intense, palpable anger.
And interestingly, it's not directed just at the shooter. His fury is aimed at the societal mechanisms, the media blackouts, and the lack of transparency that frequently follow these events to protect the guilty, the gun manufacturers, or the powerful politicians.
The core argument is piercing. You cannot stand in the blood-soaked aftermath of a massacre, or look at the rubble of a bombed city and ask the heavens, why did God let these children die?
Because the divine didn't build the assault rifle. The divine didn't sign the declaration of war. Humans manufactured the weapons, humans chose to pull the trigger, and humans dropped the bombs.
Pointing the finger at the sky is the ultimate evasion of moral responsibility. When societies commit or tolerate atrocities, shifting the blame to a mysterious divine plan is a cowardly way of dodging human accountability.
And to drive this point home about human tyranny and the desperate need for accountability, the lecture dives into a harsh historical critique, specifically targeting Ottoman politics.
And again, framing this purely as a speaker's perspective, he doesn't hold back on his critique of the Ottoman practice of fratricide.
The institutionalized killing of brothers to secure the line of succession.
It was a brutal political calculus designed to prevent civil war by eliminating any rival claimants to the throne.
The lecture points out that Fatih Sultan Mehmet, the conqueror of Constantinople, officially legalized this practice. The thinker highlights the gruesome reality that Mehmet had his own infant brother, a 6-month-old baby, strangled in his crib.
And it goes on to mention a later sultan, Mehmet III, who had 19 of his brothers executed in a single night upon taking the throne.
19. In one night.
The philosophical point being made here is a deep lamentation about human psychology. The thinker laments that people today, centuries later, often romanticize these historical murders out of a twisted sense of power worship.
People bend over backwards to empathize with the tyrant, arguing that he had to make the tough, pragmatic call for the stability of the empire, rather than empathizing with the innocent victims, like an infant who never had a chance to speak.
It is a devastating critique of how the worship of power completely corrupts our moral compass. When we become infatuated with empire, success, and sheer dominance, we find ourselves willing to excuse or even praise absolute atrocities committed in the name of statecraft.
It's like blaming the architect of a beautiful, intricate apartment building because the tenants decided to buy gasoline and set the lobby on fire.
We set the fire.
We burn the building down, and then we stand in the ashes and blame the architect for the design. But it always leads me back to this fundamental question. Why give the tenants matches at all? Why wire the human brain with the capacity for such horrific tyranny and violence?
Because the alternative is an existence devoid of consciousness. The lecture's view on the necessity of choice is foundational here. Without the option to choose evil, without access to the matches, human beings are functionally no different than a colony of bacteria.
Because a bacterium does not make moral choices.
Right, it simply reacts mechanically to chemical stimuli in its environment. For human beings to operate as genuine moral agents, for concepts like love, mercy, or justice to have any actual meaning or value, the choice to do the opposite must be real.
And if the choice is genuinely real, it mathematically necessitates the possibility of terrible, tragic outcomes.
You cannot build a system capable of the highest heights of human virtue without simultaneously exposing it to the risk of the darkest depths of human depravity.
And this critique of human tyranny and the profound danger of worshiping ruthless power leads perfectly into the text's fifth layer, because if the Ottoman sultans or the great historical conquerors aren't the ideal blueprint for leadership, what is?
The lecture presents a model for just power in the figure of Zulkarnain.
Zulkarnain, a name which translates to the two-horned one. Now, if we look at the broader picture of historical commentary, this figure has frequently been conflated by historians with Alexander the Great.
But the lecture vehemently, almost aggressively, denies this connection.
If you're wondering why the thinker pushes back so hard against that, Alexander was arguably the most successful military commander in human history. It comes down to the mechanics of ego.
Exactly that. Alexander the Great represents everything the text opposes. The lecture points out the historical reality of Alexander's campaigns. When he conquered Egypt, he didn't just rule.
He traveled to the Siwa oasis and allowed the oracle to declare him a literal living god,
the son of Amun-Zeus. Furthermore, his military expansion involved the merciless slaughter of populations that resisted him, leaving a trail of blood from Gaza all the way across Anatolia and into Persia.
Alexander represents the absolute pinnacle of human power married to unchecked ego and bloodshed, whereas Zulkarnain is presented as the exact polar opposite.
Zulkarnain is the archetype of immense power married to ultimate restrained justice. He does not claim divinity. He operates strictly as a servant entrusted with power.
In the narrative of his journeys, there is a crucial testing moment. He encounters a vulnerable people living in the mud, completely at his mercy. The divine narrative essentially hands him a blank check.
He is given the choice to punish them or to treat them well.
And the lecture argues this is the ultimate defining test of every single person who holds authority, from the head of a massive state down to the head of a household. When you possess absolute, unchecked power over someone weaker than you, do you choose justice, or do you succumb to the intoxicating thrill of tyranny?
And Zulkarnain's commitment to justice is illustrated in a really surprising, countercultural way.
Yeah, the lecture describes him traveling to the east and encountering a tribe that is living completely naked, unshielded from the sun.
Now, if you are reading an ancient religious text, you would naturally expect the narrative to immediately condemn this tribe as sinful, shameful, or barbaric.
You'd expect the hero to force them to cover up. But I found this detail utterly fascinating. The text does not condemn them.
It doesn't.
It simply states that this is how they lived, and Zulkarnain moves on without molesting them.
The neutrality of the text is the entire point. Zulkarnain doesn't unleash his army to force them into clothing, he doesn't destroy their culture, and he doesn't impose his own societal norms upon them.
The thinker uses this specific ancient detail to launch a massive, highly relevant critique against modern religious Puritans.
He targets people who are obsessed with erasing natural human differences, or those who try to hide women away in sacks out of a distorted, hyperfixated sense of morality.
He shares a deeply tragic personal anecdote to highlight the psychological sickness of this mindset. He talks about counseling a married couple who are fighting over their 7-year-old daughter.
One parent was actively forbidding the other from showing the child basic parental love and physical affection.
Why? Because of a twisted, austere interpretation of religion that viewed any worldly love, even the love for a child, as a dangerous distraction from the divine?
It is a devastating example of how imposing an artificial, rigid uniformity destroys fundamental human goodness. It suffocates the soul.
But if you look at the broad sweep of human history, if the foundational texts are so tolerant of differences, why do historical empires and religious institutions almost always default to enforcing uniformity?
It's a great question.
Why does institutional power always want everyone to dress the same, pray the same, and think exactly the same?
Because from a purely logistical standpoint, uniformity is infinitely easier to control than diversity. A monolith is easier to govern than a mosaic.
But the lecture offers a brilliant theological counterargument to this impulse. If God wanted, he could have forced everyone to believe.
He could have engineered humanity to be entirely uniform, biologically and psychologically. The fact that we are not uniform means that diversity is the intentional design.
Therefore, utilizing state power or violence to erase differences isn't an act of piety. It is an act of war against the Creator's explicit design.
The lecture boils it down to a blunt, unforgettable maxim. A state without justice is nothing more than organized banditry.
Organized banditry, that phrase really sticks with you. It challenges you to look back at the timeline of history and meticulously separate the actual golden ages of civilization from periods of highly organized, state-sponsored banditry.
And to prove that Islamic history did, in fact, once value this kind of open-minded pursuit of knowledge, tolerance, and diversity, the lecture points to a largely forgotten golden age.
It sets up a stark contrast between the narrow, inquisitorial mindset of later centuries and an era of massive, state-sponsored, unbridled curiosity.
The lecture dives into the historical quest to actually locate the physical wall that Zulkarnain supposedly built.
It mentions the Abbasid Caliph al-Wathiq, who actually funded real-life, massive geographical expedition.
He commissioned an explorer named Salim al-Tarjuman,
Equipped him with 50 elite guards, a staggering budget, and sent him out into the unknown just to explore the edges of the map and find this wall. The sheer level of state investment in geographical curiosity is mind-blowing.
It really is. And it was indicative of the larger intellectual ethos during the Abbasid Golden Age. The lecture expands on this by focusing on Caliph al-Mamun, who ruled in the early 9th century.
Al-Mamun heavily funded the legendary Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, in Baghdad.
We are talking about an institution that encompassed up to 40 massive libraries, functioning as the premier universities and research centers of the entire planet.
The lecture notes that the scientists of this era literally mapped the Earth down to the meter. They didn't just guess.
They used advanced geometry and astrolabes, tracking the angle of the sun across the Syrian desert to calculate the circumference of the globe with astonishing accuracy.
And al-Mamun's insatiable hunger for knowledge did not stop at geography or internal Islamic theology. He actively, aggressively sought out knowledge from rival empires.
He dispatched emissaries to the Byzantine emperor to purchase banned books of Greek philosophy, advanced mathematics, and astronomy.
And he didn't just buy them. He paid for the translated manuscripts with their physical weight in solid gold.
Think about the mechanics of that. Paying for a stack of paper with its exact weight in gold.
That is the ultimate, undeniable proof of a society valuing information over material wealth.
This was the intellectual furnace that produced the giants of human history. Men like Al-Khwarizmi, who developed the foundational principles of algebra.
The algorithms that literally run the software we are using today.
Al-Kindi, the great philosopher who synthesized Greek thought with Islamic theology. Jabir, widely considered the father of early chemistry. The scientific foundation of the modern world was forged in this specific environment of state-funded curiosity.
But the lecture expresses a deep, palpable frustration at how the broader narrative of history remembers this exact era. Despite all of this, the mapping of the Earth, the invention of algebra, the translation movement, the House of Wisdom,
Later generations of conservative Orthodox historians branded al-Mamun's era as the Mina.
Which translates to the Inquisition or the time of trial.
It's a fascinating study in how history is rewritten by the victors of theological disputes.
And why was it called an Inquisition? Because of a highly specific theological debate regarding the created nature of the Quran, during which a prominent scholar, Ahmad bin Hanbal, was imprisoned and given 33 lashes by the state.
Now, obviously, state-sponsored violence and lashing a scholar is wrong.
Absolutely. But the thinker points out the glaring, almost comical hypocrisy. These same historical voices will brand an era of unprecedented global scientific illumination as a dark time over 33 lashes given to one man.
Yet they will turn around and offer praise and apologia for actual blood-soaked tyrants.
They will defend figures like the Umayyad Caliph Yazid, the man responsible for the massacre at Karbala, and the murder of the Prophet's own grandson.
It reveals a completely inverted prioritization. They prioritize rigid theological conformity over actual justice and human progress.
It is wild. It's the equivalent of judging the entire Apollo space program, the moon landing, the invention of satellite technology, the leap in computing, and writing it off as a failure based entirely on a single HR dispute that happened in the NASA cafeteria.
That's a great way to put it.
Why do we consistently let the loudest, most negative, most regressive voices write our history?
Because tribalism and negativity are incredibly powerful, easily manipulated human impulses. But this brings us to the lecture's ultimate warning regarding knowledge. This is why epistemological humility, admitting what we don't know, is vital.
When knowledge, even vast scientific data or complex theological memorization, is disconnected from consciousness, from that balance we discussed at the very beginning,
A society experiences total moral blindness. We end up praising murderers because they belong to our political tribe, and we condemn visionary scientists over semantic disputes.
we drown in an ocean of data, but we completely lose the meaning of the water.
We drown in data but lose the meaning.
That brings us full circle to the core premise of this deep dive. We started by looking at an X-ray, trying to find a clean break in the murky landscape of an ancient text.
And what we found instead was a mirror reflecting the incredibly complex mechanics of our own consciousness.
Let's synthesize everything we've unpacked today through the lecture's 4 ultimate lessons derived from the figure of Zulkarnain.
First, power must be fundamentally equated with justice. If power does not serve to uphold justice, it has no legitimacy. It is just organized banditry operating under a flag.
Second, he achieved his monumental goals utilizing the human mind, engineering, and human labor. He didn't sit back and wait for a magical miracle to solve the problem. He used the physical resources of the earth to enact change.
Third, knowing the truth is entirely insufficient. It's not enough to sit in an ivory tower, surrounded by your your intellectual light, feeling superior. You are obligated to use that knowledge to build a physical or metaphorical barrier to protect the vulnerable from tyranny.
And fourth, the ultimate piercing question the text leaves with every reader. Are you building that wall in your own life? Are you taking the knowledge, the RAM you've accumulated, and constructing something that protects others?
And that leads perfectly into a final, profound concept from the lecture that I want to leave you pondering. The thinker brings up the mechanics of the butterfly effect.
Now, this term wasn't coined by a philosopher. It was coined by a mathematician and meteorologist, Edward Lorenz.
He was running early computer simulations of weather patterns, trying to trace the origins of massive storm systems. He discovered mathematically that a microscopic initial disturbance, like the metaphorical flapping of a butterfly's wings in the distant African savanna,
could alter atmospheric pressure just enough to cascade, weeks later, into a massive hurricane tearing apart a distant coastline.
a tiny, seemingly insignificant flutter creating an unstoppable storm. Precisely the mechanics of chaos theory applied to morality. The lecture connects this scientific reality to everything we've discussed today.
Think about the genetics. If a microscopic mutation in the FOXP2 gene 200,000 years ago is the literal biological reason we have the capacity to speak, to form complex societies, and to analyze this text today.
And if a single butterfly in a desert can eventually engineer a hurricane, then what metaphorical wall, what tiny seed are you planting today?
What microscopic act of free will, what small agonizing tap on the brakes against your own worst biological urges, what quiet choice to favor justice over your own ego might echo through the corridors of time?
You might feel like you're just stacking a few tiny pebbles today. But the mathematics of the universe suggest that your action might cascade into a hurricane of justice centuries from now.
What a profound thought to end on. The necessary strain of interpreting the text, the biological reality of the brake pedal, the absolute imperative of building the wall.
It's a lot of RAM to process.
It is. We want to thank you, the learner, for joining us on this incredibly dense, fascinating archaeological dig of meaning. We hope this deep dive has strained the metaphorical muscles of your mind and added a little more RAM to your consciousness today. Until next time, keep questioning the underlying mechanics of the world around you and keep building those walls.
This submission is an exploration of Surah Al-Kahf, focusing on the symbolic interpretation of its parables to extract contemporary philosophical and ethical meaning.
The material makes a strong case for looking beyond literalism by highlighting the narratives of the knowledgeable servant and Dhul-Qarnayn.
Exactly. So let's dive right into how we can elevate this analysis.
We should start by setting a baseline assessment. This piece is a philosophically rich and, honestly, deeply researched archaeological excavation of meaning.
Which means the feedback is going to be rigorous. We're focusing entirely on structural coherence and thematic discipline today.
Right.
The transition between the philosophical exploration of the symbolic narrative and the historical detour into Ottoman fratricide disrupts the listener's engagement with the core thematic argument.
It really does. I mean, the material abruptly jumps from the abstract, symbolic meaning of the knowledgeable servant.
Who metaphorically kills a boy.
Right, exactly. It jumps from that into a long, highly detailed historical indictment of Fatih, Sultan Mahmud, and the institutionalized killing of siblings.
It's a huge shift.
Yeah, and the weakness is that it severs the connection to the primary text of Surah Al-Kahf. It essentially abandons the theological argument.
You're just completely stranded.
Exactly. The audience is left stranded in a 15th century political debate about the siyasatashi rather than staying focused on the philosophical dangers of literalism.
Let's look closely at the section discussing that fratricide law, though. Because, I really like the inclusion of this history.
Yeah,
I want to push back a little on the idea that it's just a disruption. The Ottoman history adds a fascinating, gritty reality to the piece. It grounds all that high-minded theology in literal blood and stone.
That makes sense. But could the evidence also support a different conclusion? While it is undeniably fascinating, the sheer volume of historical detail dilutes the scriptural analysis.
You think it takes up too much real estate?
Right. The goal is to keep the spotlight on the Quranic archaeology, not Ottoman court intrigue. So the suggestion here is to restructure these historical examples to act as subordinate, supporting illustrations rather than standalone chapters.
Ensuring they serve the primary thesis without hijacking the narrative focus.
Exactly. So for concrete examples of how to improve this, instead of a multi-minute detour cataloging the specific victims of various Ottoman rulers, condense the historical fratricide law.
Down to a few sentences?
Yeah. Make it a 2-sentence illustration of what happens when a metaphorical narrative is used to justify literal political violence.
Right. A quick punch.
And you can use a bookend technique. Introduce the Cottagites and Ottoman examples briefly to show the real-world cost of literalism, then immediately pivot back to the text.
Like stating, this is exactly why the symbolic nature of the knowledgeable servant must be understood as an allegory for divine justice, not a blueprint for human law.
Perfect. That brings the history right back to the scripture.
Which actually transitioned us perfectly to the next point, because just as historical tangents can distract, so too can an overabundance of scientific concepts.
Oh, absolutely.
The introduction of scattered scientific terminology, such as quantum entanglement and the FOSP2 gene, currently serves as distracting trivia rather than reinforcing the central theological arguments.
Is there a risk that focusing solely on showcasing breadth might overlook the power of a single deeply explored analogy?
That's a great way to frame it. The current draft is kind of like a museum where all the artifacts are just piled up in the lobby.
Right, you're tripping over them.
Exactly. But placing just one artifact on a well-lit pedestal will make a much stronger impact.
Because the weakness right now is that the text rapidly fires off references to the butterfly effect, entropy, CRISPR technology, thermodynamics,
and the FOXP2 speech gene.
Yeah. And because these concepts are dropped almost as quickly as they are raised, they feel like disconnected showpieces.
They totally disrupt the pacing.
Right, and they fail to integrate into the core interpretation of creative destruction or human free will.
So the suggestion would be to select one primary scientific metaphor to carry through the entire piece,
tying it directly to the theological concepts of chaos, order, and divine intervention.
Okay, so concrete examples for improvement. First, remove the passing references to the FOXP2 gene and CRISPR.
Yeah, they pull the focus way too far into biology, instead focus exclusively on the concept of entropy and the butterfly effect.
How would that look in the text?
Well, when discussing the knowledgeable servant damaging the boat, frame it explicitly through the thermodynamic metaphor.
So it is an act of localized chaos initiated to prevent a larger systemic entropy.
Exactly. And then you return to this exact same scientific metaphor later when analyzing Dhul-Qarnayn building the wall.
Oh, wow. So frame his actions as the ultimate anti-entropic act.
Yes, he's creating order and structure to protect society from chaos. It connects everything structurally.
That is incredibly strong. And it really tightens the overall architecture of the piece.
Which naturally connects to our final layer, the emotional delivery and tonal consistency.
Right.
The sudden tonal shifts from an objective archaeological analysis of scripture to aggressive colloquial indictments undermine the material's established intellectual authority.
It's a severe whiplash. I mean, the weakness here is that the material brilliantly frames itself early on as an archaeological excavation of language and concepts.
It builds so much trust.
It really does. But then it frequently slips into colloquial, almost combative rants.
Using phrases akin to "let them eat you alive" or calling opponents mindless.
Which is a dramatic fluctuation. It alienates an audience that is otherwise highly receptive to the sophisticated academic argument being made against dogmatism.
So what I really like about this part is the raw passion behind the defense of Abbasid-era intellectualism. It's palpable.
That's fascinating. What are the potential limitations to that approach, though?
What do you mean?
Well, when a speaker gets visibly angry, the audience stops analyzing the text and starts analyzing the speaker.
Ah, right. It becomes personal.
Exactly. Maintaining a calm, razor-sharp analytical tone makes the critique of literalism far more devastating and undeniable.
So the suggestion is to recalibrate the tone of the passionate arguments to match the academic gravity of the excavation metaphor.
Allowing the sheer strength of the historical and scriptural evidence to serve as the indictment, rather than relying on emotional outbursts.
Okay, so for a concrete example, when critiquing the Abbasid period and the suppression of the House of Wisdom, remove the colloquial attacks.
Right. Instead, use the clinical, philosophical tone from the earlier Truth versus Reality segment.
To dissect the tragic irony of how dogmatic literalism destroyed a golden age of science.
Exactly. And the same goes for when the author discusses modern parents who hide behind literalist interpretations to restrict their children's lives.
Oh yeah, the tone there transitions to raw exasperation right now.
It does. It needs to transition to a profound, tragic observation instead. Like, pointing out how smothering differences is an act of rebellion against a creator who designed diversity.
Wow. Yes. Let the philosophical weight do the heavy lifting there.
It's so much more powerful than just venting on the page.
It really is. So to succinctly recap the core architectural changes today, subordinate its historical tangents so they serve the scriptural thesis.
Consolidate the scientific references into one cohesive thermodynamic metaphor.
And elevate the tone to maintain an authoritative, archaeological calm throughout.
We really want to remind the listener that the foundational material here is incredibly strong.
Truly.
It's just bursting with brilliant connections between ancient wisdom and modern philosophy.
Absolutely. We highly encourage the listener to apply these structural edits and submit the revised work back to the critique for another review.
Okay, welcome to the debate. Imagine for a second that you possessed a machine capable of scanning a child's DNA.
Okay.
And let's say this machine could tell you with, absolute mathematical certainty that this child would grow up to become a violent serial killer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Would you execute them today before they've committed a single crime?
I mean, it sounds completely dystopian, like a sci-fi nightmare, basically.
It really does. But thousands of years ago, ancient sacred texts posed this exact scenario. And how we choose to answer it completely alters the foundation of human justice.
Right.
So today, we are looking at how we interpret morally complex, sometimes incredibly violent, and seemingly paradoxical narratives in our historical and sacred source materials. Specifically, we're dissecting the traditions within Surah Al-Kahf.
Yes, a really fascinating text.
We're going to look at the story of Moses and the wise servant, as well as a legend of the great leader Zulkarnain.
And the crux of our disagreement here is really about what we do with the profound discomfort these stories cause.
Precisely. The central question before us is this. Should these narratives be understood purely as symbolic, philosophical allegories designed to expand human consciousness? Or, must we confront them as literal, historical realities that test the extreme, messy boundaries of law, genetics, and statecraft? My position is that this material explicitly uses highly symbolic language for a very specific purpose: to stretch the mind. Treating these stories as literal events, or worse, trying to use them as legal precedents, inevitably leads to catastrophic moral failures.
I see.
Historically, it has been used to justify the unjustifiable, from murder to absolute tyranny. The text is meant to be a mirror for the intellect, not a manual for the executioner.
Well, in my position is that reducing these narratives to pure metaphor is a convenient way to sidestep the brutal realities the material actually intends for us to confront.
Interesting.
By grappling with the literal boundaries of these stories, and that includes real-world genetic predestination and actual physical historical expeditions, we gain true wisdom, rather than just, philosophical comfort.
Right.
The material forces us to look at the physical world as it actually operates, not just some idealized metaphorical version of it.
Okay, so let's start with the function of the text itself. I actually want to bring up an analogy to ground what I mean by stretching the mind.
Go for it.
If you want to upgrade a computer's ability to process complex information, you don't give it easier tasks. You install more RAM.
Sure.
You force the hardware to handle a heavier, more paradoxical load, which expands its underlying capacity. I argue that the primary goal of deeply layered texts like Surah Al-Kahf is exactly that. It's a cognitive upgrade. The mind only expands when it encounters a paradox it cannot easily resolve.
I actually really like that framing because it acknowledges that the material is undeniably difficult. It acts as a sort of resistance weight for the brain.
It is deeply difficult. I mean, if our listeners are hearing this narrative for the first time, let's be completely honest. The actions described in the text sound insane.
They do.
Moses goes on a journey with this wise servant who possesses a sort of divine foresight, and the servant commits 3 seemingly atrocious acts. First, he deliberately damages a functioning ship that belongs to poor laborers.
Right.
Then, he outright kills a young boy. Finally, after a town refuses them the most basic ancient right of hospitality, the guest law, he rebuilds a collapsing wall for them without asking for a wage. If you read this literally, it is sheer madness. It's vandalism, it's murder, and it's irrationality.
Moses certainly thought so. He was furious.
Exactly, and that is the key to the whole thing. Moses, representing human law and rationality, rightfully protests every single time. He is the audience surrogate here. The text is screaming at us that these actions are purely symbolic. They are meant to demonstrate that there are unseen layers of knowledge in the universe, that every knower has someone above them who knows more.
But why must they only be symbolic?
Because when this metaphor falls into the hands of the ignorant and is taken literally, it turns into actual physical violence.
Okay, but...
Just look at the historical example the material gives us, the extreme Khidrites. They looked at the wise servant's preemptive killing of the child and said, well, we also possess divine foresight. We know who the enemies of God are.
Right.
And they used that literal interpretation to justify slaughtering entirely innocent families. They took a symbol of divine wisdom and turned it into a literal license to kill. Metaphor, when taken literally by the ignorant, is simply murder.
Look, I don't disagree with the absolute danger of literalism in the hands of extremists. The Khidrite example is chilling, and it shows the horrific consequences of arrogance.
Absolutely.
But you can't just wave away the violent parts of the text by slapping a symbolic label on them just because they make our modern sensibilities uncomfortable.
I'm not just waving them away.
Well, but you are separating them from reality. The material establishes a very crucial difference between reality, which is the literal physical event, and truth, which is the underlying wisdom. They are not mutually exclusive.
But if the literal reading yields a moral contradiction, like murdering a child, isn't the symbolic reading the only responsible path?
Not when the material itself explicitly brings up modern physical realities to ground these dilemmas.
What do you mean?
The text isn't just floating in a realm of abstract philosophy, it actively points to the physical constraints of biology. It brings up the FOXP2 speech gene, a literal 200,000-year-old biological mutation that physically built the hardware in the human brain and throat for language.
Okay, yes, it mentions genetics.
It brings up the concept of murder genes and deep-seated kleptomania. The text is proving that we do, in fact, face literal biological versions of the wise servant's dilemma today. We have people with physical, genetic predispositions toward violence.
But that's exactly where the danger lies.
Let me just finish this thought because it's vital. Treating the text as mere allegory neuters its ability to challenge our real-world systems of justice. It's not just a philosophical puzzle about unseen knowledge. It's a brutal question about what we do when biological reality violently clashes with human law.
Okay, I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the fundamental epistemological function of the text. How is it meant to be applied?
All right.
The source material makes a brilliant distinction. It says the text can either be light or it can be fire. It's either a source of illumination or it burns your house down.
And I would argue the fire only happens when you lack the wisdom to handle the physical reality.
No, the fire happens when you misplace the truth. The material uses this incredibly vivid, almost visceral analogy about a single strand of hair.
Right, the soup analogy.
Yes, hair on your head is a beautiful thing. It's an adornment. But find that exact same hair floating in your bowl of soup, and it is disastrous. It causes physical revulsion. It ruins the meal.
Because it's out of place.
Exactly. The hair itself hasn't changed. The difference is placement. The text defines oppression as putting something where it does not belong. Taking a purely symbolic, divine text and placing it into literal human legal reality is putting a hair in the soup. It turns enlightenment into destruction. The text wasn't designed to be a literal blueprint for human courts. When you force it to be one, it burns you.
I mean, that is a beautiful analogy, but you are assuming the philosophy of the text is somehow entirely divorced from physical mechanics.
Not divorced, just operating on a different plane.
But the text grounds its most profound wisdom in the friction of physical reality. Consider the butterfly effect mentioned in the material. This isn't just a poetic metaphor for small things mattering. It's rooted in the hard mathematics of meteorology.
Right, the chaos theory concept where small causes have massive effects.
Yes, but physically, mechanically, the material specifically traces a 280-kilometer-per-hour hurricane, destroying cities in America all the way back to a thermal differential in the Savahil.
The edge of the savannah.
Exactly, the exact edge of the savannah in Africa, where the desert meets the green. It traces it back to the literal flapping of a butterfly's wings altering the air pressure.
Sure, but...
My point is that the massive, sweeping philosophical truths you are talking about, they are generated by actual physical friction in the real world. If you abstract the story of the wise servant too much, you lose the terrifying reality that in our physical world, a tiny, seemingly insignificant physical variable can cause a hurricane. The physical stakes are the whole point.
All right, if we accept your premise that the physical stakes are the point, we have to look directly at the most difficult part of the narrative, the preemptive killing of the child.
Yes, let's look at it.
The wise servant kills a boy because, allegedly, he would grow up to be a tyrant or a deeply evil person. If we take that literally, as a physical reality we must grapple with, it is plain murder. It violates every modern legal framework we have.
It certainly does. Our legal frameworks are based on actions, not potential.
It violates ancient frameworks too. It violates the ancient guest law, which was the absolute bedrock of human civilization before state security existed, where a stranger's life was sacred. True, it violates the foundational medical maxim, first, do no harm. You cannot punish a crime that hasn't happened. This is why Moses, who represents the human standard of justice, was right to be outraged. And You know, when empires try to literalize this concept of preemptive harm, the results are monstrous.
You're referring to the Ottoman statecraft and the policy of fratricide.
I am, because it is the perfect example of literalizing the wise servant's actions. Look at Fatih Sultan Mehmet. He was a brilliant intellectual, arguably a genius.
Absolutely.
He looked at the chaos of civil war, where tens of thousands of people die over succession, and he legalized fratricide, the killing of brothers, to preemptively prevent that harm. What was the literal, physical result of that policy?
It was brutal.
It led to his only 6-month-old brother, Ahmed, being strangled in a cradle. It led to a later sultan murdering 19 of his own brothers and sons in a single night. This is the ultimate danger of your physical friction. When you take a symbol of divine foresight and make it a literal law of state, you become a serial killer wrapped in the justification of preserving order.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it's quite that simple. I won't deny the horror of the Ottoman fratricide. It is a chilling example of human arrogance. But you're looking at a misapplication of the principle and using it to dismiss the underlying biological reality the text wants us to confront.
A misapplication? It's the direct result.
Let's dive into the criminology aspect the material explores. Because yes, preemptive execution based on a political guess is tyranny. But what happens when the guess isn't a guess? What happens when it's a biological destiny?
Biological destiny is an incredibly dangerous phrase. It strips human beings of free will entirely.
It does, and that is exactly why the material forces us to look at it. The text brings up the example of an inmate in Goljuk prison. This man was an incurable kleptomaniac.
Right.
His innate biological drive to steal was so deeply wired into his brain chemistry that he joked he stole the midwife's face while being born. He was stealing cars, stripping them down to the axles, completely unable to stop himself, regardless of the punishment.
But kleptomania is a far cry from murder.
The mechanism is the same. Our entire legal framework assumes a person chooses to break the law. But the material asks us, what does society do with a literal serial killer driven by genetics? In a given population, there is a statistical certainty that a specific number of people possess the genetic markers for extreme, uncontrollable violence. They cannot be rehabilitated in the traditional sense.
So you're arguing that the story of the wise servant is actually an ancient exploration of genetic determinism?
I'm arguing it's a brutal thought experiment about the limits of human law when faced with incurable biological realities. In the ancient world, the blunt instrument for dealing with a genetically predetermined threat was execution.
Which is horrific.
It is, but in the near future, as the material suggests, it might be CRISPR gene editing. We might literally go into the embryo and edit the violence out of the DNA before the child is born. That is the modern equivalent of the wise servant's actions.
Wow, okay.
But you only get to that technological medical horizon if you acknowledge the literal physical reality of the threat. If the child in the story is just a safe metaphor for bad thoughts, we never have to grapple with the terrifying reality of how to build a justice system for people who are biologically wired to destroy it.
But that is exactly why the distinction between the wise servant and Moses is so critical. The material explicitly tells us that Moses is the standard for us.
Right.
We do not have divine foresight. We do not have perfect genetic scanners that operate with 100% certainty. We operate in the realm of human law, where an action must be committed before it is punished.
I agree with that.
If you grant any human institution the power to play the wise servant, to act on what someone might do based on their genes or their background, you have instantly created an oppressive state. It requires an absolutely perfect, infallible judge.
Which brings us directly to the concept of the perfect ruler. It moves us from individual morality to state-level power, which is exactly what the material does with the figure of Zulkarnain.
Yes, Zulkarnain, the two-horned leader. And here again, I argue that Zulkarnain is not a historical figure to be unearthed by archaeologists. He is a psychological archetype.
Interesting.
He represents the eternal question posed to anyone who holds immense power. Will you choose justice or oppression?
Many historical traditions try to map him directly onto Alexander the Great, though.
And the material strictly, unequivocally rejects that. Alexander the Great is the absolute antithesis of the Zulkarnain archetype.
Right.
The text reminds us of the literal history. Alexander marched 600 kilometers to the Apis temple in Egypt for the sole purpose of demanding he be worshipped as a literal god.
Yeah, the ego was massive.
He enslaved the women of Gaza after they refused to surrender to him. He murdered his own top commander, the man who taught him military strategy, simply because the commander refused to prostrate to him as a deity. Alexander was a brilliant conqueror, but he was a tyrant. Zulkarnain is a moral symbol representing power constrained by ethics, not a historical blueprint of a Macedonian king.
I actually completely agree that Alexander is a terrible fit for the moral profile of Zulkarnain. The cruelty just doesn't match the archetype. But treating Zulkarnain purely as a myth, as just a psychological archetype floating in the ether, ignores how the literal pursuit of these narratives built physical civilizations.
You're saying the myth drove the history?
I'm saying the refusal to treat it merely as a myth drove the science. Consider the Abbasid Caliph al-Wathiq, which the material highlights. He didn't just sit in a room and ponder the symbolic meaning of Zulkarnain's Great Wall.
Right, he sent an expedition.
He funded a literal physical expedition. He gave Selim the interpreter 50 guards and 5,000 dinars to march out into the terrifying unknown to find the physical coordinates of this wall.
But they were chasing a ghost. They were trying to map a spiritual metaphor onto physical geography.
But look at what that chase produced. Look at the intellectual explosion that happens when you take the physical world seriously. Look at Caliph Al-Ma'mun. He didn't just read symbols in a mosque. He quite literally measured the Earth's coordinates, mapping the latitude and longitude meter by meter from Baghdad all the way to Kabul.
That is true.
He traveled to Egypt and physically forced his way into the pyramids to see what was inside. He negotiated with the Byzantine Empire, not for gold or land, but to buy their hidden Greek philosophy and geometry books.
To build the House of Wisdom.
Exactly. He built 40 universities. He created the environment where algebra was invented, where Islamic philosophy was born. Treating the world as a physical puzzle to be solved is what birthed that golden age.
Okay, but
And the material makes a chilling point. When we lose this drive to investigate the literal physical universe, when we abstract everything into safe spiritual metaphors, we fall into dark ages. Following Al-Ma'mun's era of physical discovery, the civilization collapsed into the Inquisition period.
right, the Mehna.
Yes, an era of extreme ideological purity and oppression, where brilliant scholars were lashed 33 times in public for theological disagreements. When you stop measuring the dirt in the stars and start policing thoughts and abstract symbols, society decays. The literal pursuit of truth in the physical world is what creates the golden age. Abstraction is a luxury that often leads to dogmatism.
Wait, let me push back strongly on that, because I think you are completely misattributing the cause of the Inquisition period. The dogmatism you're talking about, the lashing of scholars, the policing of thought, that happens precisely because people take metaphors literally and turn them into inflexible dogma.
How so?
When a state decides it possesses the literal, unvarnished truth of God, it inevitably punishes anyone who disagrees.
But the scientific inquiry of Al-Ma'mun was deeply literal. He wasn't abstracting the earth, he was measuring it.
But his mind was expansive. He valued the Greek text because he understood that truth is multifaceted. The moment you decide a sacred text is merely a historical ledger or a legal manual, you shrink it. You limit its capacity to teach. The true genius of this material, particularly Surah Al-Kahf, lies in its symbolic architecture. By refusing to read it as a literal history or a legal handbook, we protect ourselves from the arrogance of claiming we have divine justification for violence.
Right.
We learn that we are Moses, bound by ethics, bound by law, entirely unable to see the future. The text is designed to stretch our minds toward true wisdom, toward the humbling realization that our knowledge is limited. It is a safeguard against the very tyranny you fear.
I hear your warning, and I really don't dismiss it. Literalism can absolutely be weaponized by the ignorant to horrific ends.
Exactly.
But, if we strip these texts of their physical and historical stakes, we turn them into safe, toothless fables. If the murdered boy is just a bad thought, and Zulkarnain's wall is just a mental barrier, the story costs us nothing.
It costs us our assumptions.
But grappling with the uncomfortable realities of genetic determinism, examining the literal expeditions of history, and facing the brutal mechanics of how justice is actually executed in a physical world, that is where true intellectual growth happens. If you only ever live in the metaphor, you never have to test your ethics against the real world.
So we arrive back at that foundational tension woven throughout the source material, the distinction between the physical reality of a situation and the deeper, underlying truth of it. I believe the text demands we look past the harsh reality to find the illuminating truth.
And I believe you cannot access the truth without wrestling with the mud, the blood, and the friction of the reality. They are bound together. The text is brilliant precisely because it refuses to let you easily separate the two.
It certainly doesn't make it easy on the reader. It demands constant, active engagement.
For sure.
It seems we both agree that these narratives are far more than simple historical accounts. They are profound tools for examining the limits of human knowledge and the foundations of justice itself. There is clearly so much more to explore in this material.
Absolutely. It's the kind of material that changes shape every time you interrogate it.
So, to our listeners, we leave you with the thought experiment we started with. Are these narratives the cognitive RAM you install to expand your mind through metaphor? Or are they the physical butterfly on the edge of the savannah, waiting to unleash a hurricane in our real, modern justice systems?
A huge question.
The answer might just change how you see everything. Thank you for joining us.